had the Holodomor, and then, about 7 years, 8 years later, the Germans came in. And in most historical accounts, the Ukrainians welcomed them with open arms for obvious reasons. And even today, there are allegations that members of the Azov battalion have kind of these Nazi tendencies. What was the Ukrainian experience during German occupation, and how did the Russians react once they kind of re-seized control of Ukrainian territory?
Ooh, that's a big story. It's a really big story, and I can recommend you a couple of good books if you're interested. But let me try to do this in as brief a fashion or as succinct a fashion as possible. First of all, there are different Ukraines to think about when you think about World War II, especially. There's Western Ukraine. Today, place like Lviv and so on. These are in Western Ukraine. They were part of Poland. Western Ukraine was part of Poland before the Second World War. So Western Ukraine had we're not under the Soviet Union. Okay, Central and Eastern Ukraine were the main republic, the Ukrainian Republic of the Soviet Union. So Kiev, a lot of these places were in Soviet Ukraine. Those two parts of Ukraine reacted differently to the Nazis and the Soviets in general. Again, there are exceptions, right? There are always exceptions. You can't say the Ukrainians any more than today, as I'm saying, you can say the Russians. So Western Ukraine was forcibly incorporated. Oh boy, it's just not easy to make these history lessons simple.
Yeah, and you don't have a lot of time too, so we just need to make sure that the audience understands that you don't have enough time to elaborate in a nuanced fashion.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's why you asked me why I don't go on the news. This is why I don't go on the news. I mean, I just assume to have a student in my office talking about this than anything. Okay, so Western Ukrainians, generally because of their antipathy to being absorbed into the Soviet Union, 39-41 under the Nazi-Soviet Pact, tended to support the Nazis. So when the Nazis then came back in and liberated them from being in the Soviet Union, it was perfectly natural for them to welcome the Nazis, the Germans in. Right. Many fought with the Germans. They had their own army, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, who initially fought with the Nazis.
Is this Stephen Bander or?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, he's one part of a larger panoply of groups. They're different groups in UPA, which is the Ukrainian Insurrection Army, right? Mm-hmm. But this was Bandera. And they fought against the Soviets. Yes, with the Nazis, right? But then when the Nazis refused to give them a separate Ukraine, which is what they were fighting for. I mean, they weren't fighting necessarily because they, liked Nazis or hated Jews. They fought because they wanted their own country, right? Which is what Ukrainians wanted. So anyway, they fought. And then once the Nazis said no, 42, 43, they switched sides and they started to fight against the Nazis. But also they didn't like the Soviets, given what the Soviets had done. So they were still going to fight against the Soviets. All right, so Ukraine, but the mass of Ukrainians, the main point is the mass of Ukrainians, fought with the Soviet Union against the Nazis. So the mass of Ukrainians were not collaborators. The mass of Ukrainians suffered terribly at the hands of the Nazis. I mean, Nazi occupation of Kiev was horrible. I mean, it was horrible. Depriving them of food, treating them like Untermenschen, putting them in camps, forcing them into labor battalions, sending them to the Reich to work forcibly sending them to the Reich to work in German factories towards the end of the war, especially. And, so the mass of Ukrainians were not Nazi sympathizers at all. They fought with the Soviets, and and there are lots of Ukrainians who died as heroes of the Soviet Union. There must be tens of thousands, who died fighting against the Nazis. Now, in the Western part, many of these UPA groups continued to fight against the Soviets. I mean, they didn't really, because they took over, the Soviets took over then Western Ukraine. The part that the Nazis had taken over, now the Soviets took over. I mean, initially it's Soviets, then Nazis, then Soviets. And now when the Soviets came back, no more Poland. This territory was taken away from Poland in the Second World War, and compensated with German territory. When the Soviets came back, then people were upset in the Western part, especially in Western Ukraine. Not so much in Eastern Ukraine. They just wanted peace and to be done with this, horrible war, which was horrible for them. It was a really a war that killed millions of Ukrainians, right? Not to mention Jews. Right? So, that's all part of that story. Now, if you take post-1991, Ukraine, some of that anti-Soviet, anti-Russian sentiment on the part of groups of Ukrainians, especially in Western Ukraine, reemerged. And, it's powerful. It's out there. Some of these, groups can be accused of being neo-Nazis, right? Some of them, were and are anti-Semitic. But on the whole, we're talking about fringe groups.
Right.
Talking about, people, after all, the neo-Nazis in Germany, and we have neo-Nazis in this country,
Right. Yeah, they're everywhere. They're everywhere.
I honestly don't think, Ukraine is sort of beset at all by these groups. But they're there, and, they're in paramilitary formations, and right now they're fighting like the Dickens against the Russians. And, we don't talk about this a lot. I don't like talking about it because Ukrainians, again, are getting pummeled by the Russians, and it's not fair. It's not just. And so, but it is true that once this war is over, and hopefully the Ukrainians win, there's going to be, and even Zelensky has said this in an interview, maybe we can conclude here or close to here, but I'll leave that to you. I mean, Zelensky has said himself, the Russian-Ukrainian relations, are marred forever by this war. Because the kind of anti-Russian feelings, the kind of deep Ukrainian nationalist anti-Russian sentiments, have been exacerbated by this war. And, whereas before the war, there was a lot of hybridity, a lot of mixing, a lot of mixed families. A lot of people spoke Ukrainian and Russian. And didn't mind switching back and forth, which, by the way, Zelensky can do now, and we've seen him do it. After the war, this is going to be different. Russians, even the Russians who are good now, Ukrainian patriots, are starting to study Ukrainian much more seriously and stop speaking Russian. So there's a kind of unfortunate, sad in some ways, a mixing of peoples, which, is not going to serve either group of people well. It's always a good thing, in my view, to have this kind of hybridity, to have this kind of ability to operate in multiple cultures, to have appreciation for other cultures. Many Ukrainians, knew Pushkin, as well as they knew their poets. And, that's going to be gone. That's going to be gone once this war is over because of this, hatred that has been brought about. And that's exactly what Zelensky said. This was his point, giving an interview to 4 or 5 Russian journalists a few weeks ago. Not a few weeks ago, it was last week, I think.
So, Dr. Naimark, you actually answered my second question, but I was going to ask if there was any hope for any sort of reconciliation.
I'll answer all your questions and more, probably.
So it sounds like there's going to be some period of this decoupling, even if this thing were to resolve relatively shortly. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like, subscribe, and notification buttons. Additionally, if you have any feedback, please put something in the comments below. And lastly, if you want to watch the full episode of this clip, you can find it above. Thanks again for watching.